So welcome everyone, participants, panelists, and our speaker alike to the ASA Early Career Chapter event on how to apply for an academic job. Thanks for coming. Be mindful that we're recording this event. As usual, before we get into things, we'd like to start with the acknowledgement of country. So we recognize, in the spirit of reconciliation, the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I acknowledge that from overseas in a spirit of international harmony and friendship. Personally, not in Australia at the moment, but I think it's nice to extend that to a message of international friendship. And we pay our respect to the elders past and present, and extend that to respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. As an ASA event, we comply with the usual ASA code of conduct, aimed to be inclusive to everyone, regardless of age, care responsibilities, cultural background, disability, gender, indigeneity, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical appearance or religion, and so on, and anything you can imagine. You can look that up. Of course, importantly, if you feel that anything against the code of conduct is happening during the event, please let the ASA ECR chapter know, and we'll look into it and deal with this on a very good basis, I hope. Now, today, let's get into the program at hand. Today, we're going to talk about how to apply for an academic job. The program is going to be a two-part thing. We'll first have a single speaker, Ilya Mandel from Monash, who is going to kick things off by, I'm told it's going to be more of a conversation and not a standard presentation, and give us many things to think about, hopefully. And then once Ilya is finished, we're going to break into separate breakout rooms and allow you to discuss in small groups with our panelists. Our panelists have slightly different specialities and slightly different backgrounds. I'm going to introduce them before we open the breakout rooms, so that you can decide which one who's of greatest interest first. If you're not decided at all, we can just randomly assign people, and you can, of course, move around. So the second part will allow you to discuss questions that you have, share experience, and we also had a few sample applications prepared that you might want to talk about. The panelists have those. I'm going to briefly mention the names of our panelists before I formally introduce them in full later on, at the beginning of the second part. So we have today Barbara Catinella, Sarah Martel, Ivy Wong, Chris Blake, and Chris Littman, who have kindly volunteered to help us with this. So you're gonna be able to really talk in small groups. And now I'm gonna hand over shortly to Ilya. Just gonna say, before I do that, and now I move away the slides, because then you can't see the notes that I have. Briefly introduce Ilya. So Ilya is a very esteemed colleague. I've worked with him for quite some time yet. Ilya did his PhD at Caltech in 2008. He specializes in gravitational wave astronomy and also does a lot of astrostatistics aspects. Was a postdoctoral researcher at Northwestern University and MIT. and subsequently moved to a position as a lecturer at the University of Birmingham. A few years after that, got promoted to professor, and a bit later, we were able to actually acquire him at Monash, and since 2019, he's been in Australia and also very active in the ASA in various roles, currently in the as the lead of the Anita chapter. And yeah, I look forward to hearing Ilya's thoughts on how to apply for an academic jobs, the do's and don'ts, what to do. And please go ahead, Ilya.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Bernard, and thanks to everyone for coming along. As Bernard said, I'm not going to share slides because I have myself had too much Zoom poisoning in recent days, weeks, months, and years, and I figured that this way we can at least try to bring it as close as possible to a conversation. So please do feel free to interrupt and ask questions, especially given that we have a relatively small group. As Bernard said, my trajectory is that I grew up in Russia. I did my undergrad and PhD work in the US at Stanford and Caltech respectively, did a couple of postdocs there, then moved to the UK, then moved to Australia, and in the process have failed at a spectacularly large number of job applications. So I suppose I'm not sure I'm completely qualified to answer the question of what you should do in a job application, but I feel from personal example, I can at least list a number of things you should not do, because probably I've done all of the ones you should not do at one time or another myself. In some cases more than once, because I'm very bad at learning from even my own mistakes. I have also served on various search panels, of course. While at Birmingham, I was in charge of hiring PhD students for a number of years for the entire department. I have obviously hired a number of postdocs over the years, and have also served in various faculty search panels, have also reviewed fellowship applications in different countries, obviously Australia, the UK, and the US, but also places like the Netherlands and so on. So I have some idea of how things work in different ecosystems, and hopefully can give a somewhat general view of some suggestions, especially, as I said, for things you should not do. So I thought I would break this up into kind of 4 big questions. The first one is where to apply, because that's probably something you should think about before even submitting a job application. The second one is how to write the application. The third one, how to interview, if there is an interview. And the last one, perhaps, if you are successful at the interview, is how to negotiate afterwards. I'll mostly focus on the how to write the application part, because I think that's probably what most of you are most interested in, but I'll at least briefly comment on some of the others. And of course, please feel free to ask questions or start a discussion either now or afterwards in the breakout sessions. So where to apply? Well, there are a few things in my mind to consider here. Of course, one thing to do is to be realistic about your own strengths and your own suitability for particular jobs. And that means, for instance, realistically, if you are contemplating, let's say, changing your research direction, it may be much trickier if, for example, you're applying for a postdoc in a field that's very different from the one in which you did your PhD, because it doesn't mean you cannot do it. I've actually done it. I did my PhD in classical general relativity, and I decided I wanted to do astrophysics as a postdoc, because the last year of my PhD, I realized astrophysics was way more interesting than computing solutions to Einstein's equations numerically. But it may not come as a surprise to you that when I was applying for postdocs, I decided, just in case, to apply for some postdocs in the area in which I was working previously and some postdocs in astrophysics. The postdocs that I was applying to in various formats of general relativity and data analysis, those applications went reasonably well. I got a few decent offers. the applications I was making in astrophysics, nobody was responding to. I don't mean I was getting no's. I mean, people were so uninterested in me that they didn't even think I merited a response because they just figured I was a crackpot. I think it's a fair thing to expect that. And it doesn't mean you cannot be done, because in the end, I did end up doing turning towards astrophysics for my postdoc, but it might mean that you have to think a little bit harder about how to make that connection, how to sell yourself. So for example, in my case, I was successful or lucky, depending on your point of view, in finding a research group that needed my previous set of skills because of the grant they had, but primarily was focused in the area that I was interested in. So I knew that by going there, I could give them something they wanted, and they were willing to hire me as a result, but also I could get something that I wanted out of that position, namely the milieu of people who were primarily working in the new area I was more interested in, and who were going to teach me on the job all of the things that were missing in my education and my expertise. It also means that you should, as I said, be just mentally prepared for disappointment and not take it too hard. A rejection of your application is not a personal rejection. Doesn't mean that you are a bad person. Doesn't mean you are not clever enough or not hardworking enough. It just means that there are lots of applicants out there. Some of them may appear to be better suited for the particular position you're applying for, and that's okay. Don't sweat about it. Sometimes it can also be helpful to do silly things to encourage yourself. So again, I'm going to give you a personal example. I was visiting just as I was after a couple of years of my first postdoc, I thought it would be time to apply for some fancier fellowships. And I happened to be visiting my good friend John Gare, who at that time was at Cambridge, and he took me out to a nice dinner in the college. And he showed me at the end of the dinner this set of bets that people from that college had been making. There's a sort of this series of books of bets that people make apparently at fancy dinners at Cambridge colleges over several hundred years. And you can see, what kind of bets people were making in the 19th century. And this inspired me to offer him a bet. I said, I'm going to apply for some fellowships, and I want an insurance bet. I want you to promise that you'll take me to a nice dinner if I fail to get a single fellowship. And he said, okay, it's a deal, but you have to apply to at least 10 fellowships. Okay, if you just apply to one, the risk is too high for me. So I'll take you to a nice dinner if you apply to at least 10 fellowships and get none. But if you get at least one offer, then you're taking me to a nice dinner. I got 9 rejections, but John got his dinner. I managed to get one fellowship successfully, right? So sometimes numbers can also help out. And so I would say, okay, this is generally a question about how many places you should apply to. I'm not going to pretend that I know the answer. It depends obviously on your career stage, where you are, what you think your stock is worth in the job market. But one thing I would suggest is, in terms of don'ts, don't apply to places where you will not go. So even if, imagine that this is going to be the only place that's going to offer you a job, but you're going to say, look, I'm not interested in moving to South Dakota because the University of South Dakota is the only place that offered me a job, because it's too far from family, it's too far from friends. I just don't like the climate in South Dakota, whatever your reason is, right? If that's your answer, don't waste their time, don't waste your time, don't apply there. Otherwise, if you think at least there's a realistic chance that you might want that position, in principle, okay, you lose nothing except for your time, and then it's up to you to decide what the expectation value is. What are the things you might care about? Well, I already mentioned one, location. I'm going to, funnily enough, start with that one. I know it's the last one that people start with because everybody talks about how important some place is for your career. Go to Harvard because it'll be a wonderful thing in your CV. But you know what? If you're going to hate it there, you're not going to work well, because if you are not enjoying your life, you're also not going to be able to concentrate in your job, and you're not going to be having fun. And it's not going to do you any good if it's good for your career if you're completely miserable there. And most of the people who I've spoken to who have regretted their time in whatever position, PhD, postdoc, etc., have done so because they felt like they made some sacrifices and those sacrifices didn't pay off. So my suggestion is don't make sacrifices. If you should be doing a job because you are enjoying this job as it is now, not because you're hoping that this job is going to be your ticket to something in the distant future. That ticket might not materialize. There's no guarantee that just because you take that job which you're not enjoying, that you will get that nicer carrot down the line. But also, even if you do get it, that carrot might not be all that nice. You think that a faculty job is wonderful. Turns out that you have to do a lot of teaching, grant applications, admin, and you have a lot less time for research than you thought before. Postdoc is probably a better job, frankly, than a faculty job. So don't sacrifice for something in the distant future. Do it because it's fun at the moment. So if the location doesn't suit you because you don't like the climate, because it's too far away from family, whatever, don't bother applying. That said, of course, it's nice to go to places which tick the prestige box. It's absolutely true, even though I agree it's completely unfair, that when people look at your next stage of applications, they do look at what you've done previously. That means that those people are outsourcing their opinions or their decision-making to some previous panel, which they don't even know. So yes, it's absolutely silly that if you got a Hubble Fellowship or you were a postdoc at the IAS, your chances of getting a faculty job, or at least getting the shortlist for a faculty job, are larger than if you were a postdoc at Monash. But all that means is that the person who is considering you on the faculty shortlist is really outsourcing their decision-making to some unknown people who were on the Hubble Fellowship panel 5 years ago. Is it ridiculous? Yes, it is. Sadly, that's how it works. So prestige does help. It does open doors. It also provides opportunities for interacting with a wider variety of people, because often those prestigious institutions are institutions where lots of people are passing through. There are lots of interactions. There's a lot of opportunity for network building, and all of those things matter. Oftentimes, it also means more resources, and resources are important. People can be great anywhere. People at Swinburne are often much nicer to work with than people at the CFA at Harvard. And Chris, yes, you're on my screen at the moment. But that said, it should be, again, the people, that depends a little bit on where you are in the career stage. Of course, you want to have good colleagues, you want to have good collaborators, you want to have good mentors if you are still at a relatively early career stage. At the same time, for example, if you're applying to institutions in the US for a PhD, let's say, generally speaking, you will be admitted to the institution or the PhD program, not to a particular faculty advisor. And so then you still have some time to decide who is the right faculty mentor for you after, let's say, you get that PhD offer from Caltech, right? So you don't have to find the right person in advance. Okay, I think I spent enough time on the where to apply. What about how to write the application? Okay, well, first of all, before you write the application, people sometimes ask whether it's reasonable to make pre-contact to get in touch with the people that you're applying to. I don't think it's just reasonable. I think it's a wonderful idea. Ideally, not something silly like, oh, I haven't actually been bothered to read the instructions for the application. Can you remind me what they are? Yes, please do read the instructions. Instructions are very important. And I've seen applications that were very good that got tossed out because the applicant just didn't follow the instructions. In some cases, the instructions have to be followed very precisely. But that said, that probably shouldn't be the question you're contacting about. The question to contact about is ideally, something that's scientific, something that inspires the person on the other side to think, I would like to work with this applicant. It would be really nice to have this applicant as a colleague or as a junior colleague at my institution. The main thing, though, for the application when you're writing it is probably the thing you have most control over is your statement of research interests, or your statement of purpose, or your research philosophy, or whatever it may be called, given the application. There, I would say the main thing is to explain your vision. That's what people are really looking for, especially if you are applying for something like either a faculty position or a postdoc fellowship. People want to see that you have an idea for where your research is going on a multi-year timescale, that you have plans going forward, that you can articulate those plans, and that you can explain why your research is important to a non-expert. And that last part is key. So a lot of the applications I've seen err on the side of assuming too much expertise on the part of the reader. Now, that can sound tempting. For example, if you're applying, let's say for your first postdoc, you just finished your PhD, you're applying to, okay, you know that your application is going to be read by some senior faculty, and you think, okay, well, those senior faculty, surely they know way more than I do. Surely I can, launch straight into the gory technical details. You're sorely mistaken. Those faculty are likely much less in touch with the technical details than you are. And if you start your application by telling them that you're going to run the multi-nest algorithm with the SUBNR4 waveforms on the LIGO 03 data release, they will say, huh? Even though those are all sensible words, that's not and even if they do understand those words, they will still be unimpressed because they're failing to see that statement of vision. You want to explain to them why this is important research, why this is a worthy goal, and then fair enough, you can say something about the technical aspects. But in some sense, especially if you are already at least applying for a postdoc position, meaning you've already done a PhD, people assume that you're technically competent, right? What they're looking for really is that vision, that understanding of the big picture, that ability to come up with your own research projects, that ability to tie things together. So keeping it simple is very important. Proofreading is surprisingly important. You might think that this is an obvious one. Unfortunately, it's not, in the sense that there are a very large number of applications that just look like the person has not taken the time to proofread. And sometimes it can be just lots of typos or awkward, unfinished sentences or poor grammar. Sometimes it can be things like, me at Monash getting a letter for a postdoc position I just advertised saying, I have always dreamed of working at ANU. Now, I don't mind the fact that somebody's also applying to work at ANU. ANU is a wonderful place. I expect people to be applying to multiple positions. That's not the problem. The problem is it tells me that not only did they not bother to think about why they're applying to Monash and maybe make some special extra case why Monash is the right place for them, which is a good thing to do. But they didn't even bother proofreading their application, right? And that's a bad sign from my point of view because, well, okay, if they haven't, a job is something pretty important, right? If you cannot be bothered to proofread something which is likely to give you a salary and a job, chances are you won't be bothered to proofread your code or won't be bothered to proofread the papers you're going to be writing. And if you cannot be bothered to make the grammar correct in your statement of research interests, that means that if we're going to be working together, I'll have to do a lot of work editing your papers, for example, right? So that's or if you're looking for a faculty job, again, that might tell me that when you're applying for external grant proposals, your chances are going to be reduced because you're not going to be putting in the effort to make those grant proposal applications crisp and succinct and beautiful looking and so on. So I think it's pretty important to do that. One question is, how specific do you want to make the application? How specific, how confidently do you want to talk about your particular research goals? I don't know what the right answer is. I think the right answer depends a lot on the position you're applying for. If you're applying for a faculty job or you're applying for a postdoc fellowship where you're going to have a lot of freedom and flexibility, then absolutely you should be pretty clear that you have a research plan and you have an idea of what you'll be doing over the next several years. On the other hand, if you are applying for a PhD, for example, then maybe it's not such a good idea to write to me and tell me that, or even write to Monash if Monash has, a general astro admissions committee. It doesn't, but some universities do, and say that, since I was 2 years old, I've dreamt of working on Newton's star equations of state physics, right? Because if there is nobody on the faculty specifically interested in Newton's star equations of state physics at the moment, they might say, well, this is a great applicant, but maybe we don't want to make them an offer. They sound like this is the only thing in the world they want to do. They'll just be terribly disappointed if they come here and nobody's willing to supervise them on that particular project, right? So I would say at a very early career stage, you probably don't want to be overly specific about exactly what you want to do. At a later career stage, become increasingly specific. The more independent your job is. So if it's a grant-funded postdoc, again, make sure that maybe you want to project a vision, but at the same time, don't project it so strongly that you leave no room for the things that the grant is likely to need you to actually do. Similarly, there's a question of how location specific you want to make that written part of your application. So some people make an effort to name drop in their application. I'm applying to Monash because I want to work with Bernard Mueller and Alex Hager on stellar evolution, and with Eric Thrane and Paul Lasky on gravitational wave sources, and with Ilya on binary evolution modeling. Okay, fair enough. At the very least, it shows that you've bothered to look up who is in the Monash faculty, and that can be a good sign. It means that maybe you're serious enough about applying here, have done your research, and know at least who's around. So that's a good sign. But typically, I'm lazy, so I often, for my own applications, I haven't done a tremendous amount of let's say, specificity. So I've tried to tell the story about what it is that I'm particularly interested in, and be relatively honest about it, in the hope that, okay, if it matches, great, and if it doesn't match, okay, tough luck. And I think that honesty is actually pretty important, especially as we get into the next step, which is how to interview, because I feel that sometimes people try too hard to sell a vision that they think the hiring committee wants to see, but it's not necessarily what the hiring committee actually wants. Sometimes we don't know what the hiring committee wants if we're outside the hiring committee, and trying too hard to sell a different story might actually lead the hiring committee to not hire you when in fact you were the perfect candidate because you presented yourself as something which you're not. So I would say that being pretty honest in both your job application and your ultimate interview is actually quite important. After all, if you really have to sell very hard in the sense of trying to sell yourself for something you're not, even when doing the interview, then chances are, even if you get the job, you won't be very happy there, because you have to continue pretending to be something that you're not. That might not be a very good fit. So I think being honest there is pretty important. Of course, that said, you should at some level give them what you want if they're desperately asking for it within reason. So again, I was not on the job on the faculty hire position on that particular occasion, but a former colleague of mine was applying for a faculty job, and afterwards I happened to have dinner with the head of the faculty search committee, and the head of the committee said, we had a shortlist interview, and your colleague kept on talking about how he wanted to work on exoplanets, and we were actually hiring people in the field of gravitational waves primarily, and we knew that he had done a lot of work on gravitational waves as well as exoplanets, but we kept on asking him, but wouldn't you also be interested in gravitational waves? And he just kept on going on and about exoplanets, and we said, but that's wonderful. We're glad to hear you like exoplanets, but some of your time you will spend on gravitational waves, right? And he just kept going on about exoplanets, and eventually we had to say, okay, well, if you're so interested in exoplanets, given that our primary search is for gravitational waves, we're not going to include you in the shortlist. So, if you're given multiple hints, consider taking them. Do listen to what the people are asking for. Also prepare and make sure you understand the process. The processes are very different in different locations. The US faculty hire is very different from the Australian or British faculty hire. In the US, for example, you generally, in addition to giving, of course, a seminar, that's standard in most places, but you go and walk around the department and have meetings one-on-one with a lot of the faculty in the departments. In the UK, you may not have any one-on-one meetings, at least not any formal ones, and you may just have a group interview with the hiring committee, and that's it. So make sure you understand and you know what to prepare for. It's okay to ask. That's a perfect, if you're not given clear instructions about how long your seminar should be or what's expected to be included or what the process will look like, absolutely feel free to ask. So Bernard is writing that he had to give an 8-minute talk in a group interview. Yeah, I think it very much depends, even within a country, on exactly what the system is. And I think, there is no right and wrong solution. It's simply that you should be aware of what to expect. And if you're not given clear instructions, absolutely do ask about that. Think about some of the standard questions that are likely to be asked. There are lots of resources for that. If you, I can share some links afterwards if people are interested, where people have thought through some of the questions that are likely to be asked at different career stages. You can pretend to have a mock interview with some colleagues or maybe senior colleagues who have a little bit more experience before your real interview. But of course, the questions will be different depending on your on where you are in your career stage. But you can almost imagine the kinds of questions will be asked, right? If you're applying for a faculty job, you can be asked, how do you plan to secure funding? That's a particularly relevant question if you're coming from a different country. That partly shows whether or not you prepared yourself, right? If you're applying for a fact, you did your PhD and your postdocs in Australia, and you're applying for a job in the US, and you say, well, I guess I'll ask for funding from the ARC or whatever your local equivalent is. That's not going to go very well, right? People want you to at least have bothered to find out what are some of the schemes for getting grant money locally, but also they want you to know, to say, okay, what are the ideas you have? What are the particular grant proposals you might be able to sell in the short term? That just shows that you've thought these kinds of things through. Of course, in reality, these things change, but even between the time that you've applied for the job and the time you actually get the job and put in your first grant application, you may already have developed new ideas, but it's simply showing that things have changed. If you're applying for a postdoc, then maybe instead, the kind of question will be, well, we have some honor students here, and often our postdocs are asked to supervise or co-supervise honors projects or master's projects. What are some of your ideas for the kinds of honors projects you might be able to supervise, right? Again, it's more or less just checking whether you've thought these sorts of things through. And of course, one of the things you should do here is, as I already mentioned, do take the time to learn about who is going to be on your panel, who is available at the university locally, what your connections are, right? So one of the more embarrassing moments was I was on a faculty search panel in the Netherlands, and the chair of the faculty search panel, who was also the chair of the department there, was an expert on a particular topic, which was actually something that the applicant touched on in the interview. And the applicant multiple times referred to various competing works from other groups on the topic, and never once referred to the work of the faculty search panel chair, etc. Now, I don't think the search panel chair particularly, was particularly, full of ego and particularly minded that, but I think the search panel chair was more or less wondering, have you not bothered checking who is actually here and who you might collaborate with, right? You keep on talking about, somebody from another university who does these kinds of things, who you said, you've established a collaboration with, but maybe at least mention that you have the possibility of collaboration here that shows you've done your homework. So that didn't go very well, as you might guess. Another thing is, again, speaking from personal experience, make sure that you actually know the papers that you are going to be mentioning or discussing that you're a co-author on. My very first postdoc interview, one of the papers that I happened to bring up, which I was a co-author on, as a grad student, I did my little part of a paper which had multiple authors, and I didn't expect that anybody in particular would have read that paper. But as it happened, the person interviewing me had read that paper and asked me about a different part of the paper, which I had no contribution to. And being a busy grad student and rushing to submit my PhD thesis, hadn't bothered to fully understand, frankly. That did not go well, because the moment that I made it clear that even a paper that I was presenting on my CV as something that I was involved in and sort of selling as part of my experience, that I didn't really understand a significant part of that paper, yeah, I completely understand why the person interviewing me was very underwhelmed and did not offer me the job. They were right. And in their shoes, I would have done the same thing. So, don't do that, right? Make sure that if you're a co-author, make sure you actually understand the papers you're on. That's generally a good idea, whether or not you're applying for a job. But if you're applying for a job and are going to mention the paper, then be particularly careful about that. Okay. How to negotiate was the last thing I was going to mention. And I'll keep it quick here. So first of all, find out what's negotiable. That's very different in different places. Maybe it's generally moderately similar within a country. So, if you feel awkward asking, sometimes, okay, you already know somebody at the institution you're applying to and can ask them sort of informally, but if you cannot do that, at least ask somebody from a similar institution. When I was applying for a job or when I was offered a job at Birmingham and was about to have a conversation with the head of school there about my startup, I decided to ask a colleague at Manchester who recently got a job at Manchester what she was able to get there, because I figured Birmingham and Manchester probably have relatively similar finances, etc. And it turned out she told me that, well, if you get your moving expenses paid for, that's a good startup. Don't expect a US style startup with postdoc or anything of that sort as part of a startup in the UK. That was good information, right? Because at least, okay, I knew not to ask for something unreasonable. Be honest again. I mean, honesty is always a good thing. So that means in this case, make reasonable demands. Generally, if you are being given an offer at whatever level, people are interested in making sure you succeed, right? Nobody wants to hire you and then have you fail because they haven't provided you with enough resources, right? If you are an instrumentalist and you need a lab to be successful, then of course you should explain to them why you need this lab and tell them that you need to be successful. And hopefully the hiring committee are not idiots and they're not going to offer you a job and say, okay, we want you to be an instrumentalist here, but we won't pay for a single screwdriver for you. They are not stupid either, right? On the other hand, don't ask for things which you probably don't need, because it just makes you sound like you're greedy. If you realistically need, one postdoc to get off the ground, don't ask for 10 postdocs. You won't get it, and you'll just be laughed at. Also, don't make ultimatums if you aren't willing to stand behind them. Sometimes it's okay to make ultimatums. So again, I'll use a personal example. I was applying for a job in the US, and it was in a department which for a long time had not had any fresh hires. So the department was getting rather long in the tooth. And at that time, I already had a faculty job, so I was not completely desperate. And I told the hiring committee after our interview that, I'm going to, the only way I would take on this job, I really think we need, more people in astrophysics. So if the dean promises at least 2 more astrophysics hires in addition to me over the next 3 years. That worked for me in the sense that the hiring committee also wanted more astro hires, and they thought, well, okay, great. If we offer this position to Ilya, he might sort of negotiate on our behalf. We agree that we need to have more astro hires. But then, of course, once I spoke to the dean, and the dean said, no, I'm not willing to make that promise. I had to say, I'm not willing to take the job, because you don't want to say this is my red line and then look like a fool when you actually say, okay, it wasn't really my red line, because you lose all credibility. And now if you do take the job, afterwards, people are not taking you seriously when you make other requests, because they know that you don't really stand behind your own requests. You don't really, when you say something is absolutely necessary, you don't really mean it. And the other thing to keep in mind, and this is particularly true for faculty jobs, is sometimes you're in an awkward situation where you get a job and maybe it's not really the job that you were always dreaming about, and you wonder, well, should I take it or should I see what my stock is really worth in the job market? So I was very lucky, if you wish. By sheer luck, my first faculty job application was successful. I then had many unsuccessful ones afterwards, but my first one was successful. And I had this thought, okay, I didn't really expect to be successful. I was sort of applying as a trial. I just thought, well, I have never even written a faculty job application. I've never done a faculty interview. Like, let me do this for practice. I'll surely fail. Even after the interview, I was convinced I failed. Like, I will at least learn how to do it. So next time when I'm applying for my dream job, I'll know how to do it better. I got the offer. So what do I do now? And a senior colleague gave me some pretty good advice. She said, look, if you think about whether or not you could deal with being in that place for 5 to 10 years, because ultimately you're presumably getting a faculty job because you want to do research and you want to have some time, guaranteed time to do research. Now, realistically, the first few years, your stock actually might dip on the job market because initially you're so busy starting up teaching, starting up a new research group, that you might actually be less productive research-wise, and you might actually look worse than somebody who is still continuing on as a postdoc, who is able to be more productive. But in the long run, of course, you will, by virtue of having that research group, having the extra colleagues working for you, being able to show that you're successful at grant applications, which you're only really able to apply for serious grant applications as a faculty member, your stock will go up again. And so in 5 to 10 years, you might be able to leave, but probably not before then. So are you willing to be there for 5 to 10 years? And I thought about it, and the answer was yes. And I was there for exactly 7.5 years, and then I left Birmingham. But it was, I think that was very good advice, right? So think about, whether or not, you don't have to think whether or not you'll be happy there forever. Think about whether or not you'll be happy there for either a 3-year postdoc or a 5 to 10 year faculty position, and then all sorts of things can change. And the last bit of advice is be happy. It's often undersold because we are so keen on going for that job, going for that career progression. We forget that we're mostly doing it because hopefully we enjoy the subject, we enjoy doing research, we just have fun doing it. So don't forget to focus on the fun. You'll be a better scientist and a better researcher as a result. And then even if those jobs don't quite work out, you can always find jobs doing something else. And there are lots of fantastic jobs outside of academia. And of course, your advisors might be telling you to stay on the academic track because that's the one they stayed on, and it's a self-perpetuating prophecy, but self-fulfilling prophecy. But there are fantastic jobs outside of academia. Don't ignore them. Don't just think that you have to stay within the train and go from the last compartment to the next compartment to the next one, when there are beautiful green hills outside of the train with way more space and lush grass and wonderful things to do. There are fantastic things to do outside of academia as well. And within academia, things can also be fun as long as you let yourself have fun. Don't sacrifice, just enjoy it. And it can be fun. I've enjoyed it very much. I hope all of you do as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. That was very engaging and honest. Good. Yeah. So in a few announcements, in light of the number of participants, I think what we should do next is we can maybe have 2 or 3 quick questions on what Ilya said, because it just seems a bit of a waste of time to have Ilya talk and not have any questions at all. So please go ahead. Put your hand up in the chat and we'll get to you. And after that, what we'll do, we've decided now to have just 3 breakout rooms to have a nice size of a group, 2 panelists plus participants, and we'll have a gender balanced mini panel in each of those. And then it's going to be 2 senior people plus 3 or 4 junior people. I think that makes for a nice mixture. So questions for Ilya, quick questions for Ilya.
I think Julian has a hand up.
Yeah, thanks. So at the start, or sort of a little bit in, you were talking about where to apply, and obviously say there's many factors that go into this, and you shouldn't aim too high, and judge where you're planning to go, and all these things. But one thing that I've sort of struggled with over the last 6 months or so is thinking about, well, what places exist? There are many unis in the world, and many unis have astro departments, and they all have sort of interesting sounding programs. There's no ranked ordered list of, these are for this thing, or these have this sort of prestige. And, you hear various names being talked about as prestigious or, out of league or whatever. Is there any better way than just talking to people to find out what are the places available or reasonable?
So, well, if you're applying for it depends a little bit on what
postdoc-ish.
You're applying for a postdoc. Okay, so if you're applying for a postdoc position, then I think at least if you have some idea of the research area that, and hopefully you do, of the research area you're applying for, then presumably one way is to just think of what are the papers you're reading in your field that you are recent papers that you keep on citing, which groups they're coming from, right? Those are telling you which groups are doing exciting, interesting work that's attracting your attention in your field, and therefore possibly also will continue to do work that's exciting you while you're there, that are productive. I mean, one thing I haven't mentioned is if you're applying for a postdoc position, and also to some extent if you're applying for a PhD and are picking a particular supervisor, especially if the supervisor has been around for a few years, so you can gather some statistics, it's not a bad idea to look at what have their previous PhD students or their previous postdocs done, right? If a lot of the previous PhD students and postdocs have, for example, gone on to exciting faculty positions in academia, and that, let's say, is your goal, that's generally speaking a good sign. That might speak to the fact that the supervisor is very supportive, or is able to promote good networks, or is able to help the student or postdoc select exciting topics. On the other hand, if you see that despite having lots and lots of students and postdocs, nobody's staying in academia after working with the supervisor, okay, that might maybe be a sign that people are getting burned out, that people are struggling a little bit working with this person. Maybe that person is not great at advertising their students or postdocs. I mean, and it's actually, you can, as you say, talking to people is a good idea, because sometimes this kind of thing is quite visible. So, to give you an example, there are some senior colleagues who, I fairly regularly organize conferences, workshops, etc. And if I email some people and I say, would you like to come? I sort of expect they might be too busy, right? They're a very senior person. Some of them say, I'm too busy, sorry, goodbye. Fair enough. Some of them say, I'm very busy, but I have this amazing student, Julian, who's been doing fantastic work. And frankly, he could give a much better talk on this subject than I could. I really think you should invite Julian. That's a very different reply. And you might not be surprised to find out that the faculty who do that, who promote their students that way, end up placing a lot more students into more senior positions, right? So that's the kind of thing that's perhaps worth knowing about a potential mentor. What kind of a supervisor are they? And of course, okay, take a look at relevant just job advertisements, right? So AAS has the job register, things come up there. There are various, more specific emailing lists. If you're doing, I don't know, stellar modeling, subscribe to the MESA email list. Even if you're not specifically using MESA, lots of people post jobs involving stellar modeling on the MESA list, for example, right? If you are doing general relativity, there is a server called Hyperspace, which specifically hosts various postdoc ads and faculty job ads related to general relativity, right? So, okay, I don't know exactly what you're looking at the moment, but it's not a bad idea to look for some specific ads or ask your senior colleagues who are likely to get those kind of advertisements. So I frequently will get emails from colleagues around the world saying, hey, can you let your students or postdocs know about this postdoc ad that I have right now? If you tell me what you're interested in, I'm happy to forward those to you, kind of thing.
Okay.
Sorry, I know there was a lot of stuff in the chat. I haven't been able to keep up with it.
Yes. So we had a quick conversation really on how many unsuccessful applications to expect. People might have a look at that in the chat. I think you get some indicative numbers. Should we maybe just very smoothly continue this in small settings where we don't need to rely on the chat now? I think that might be a good time to break into breakout rooms. So as we do that, I'll quickly, just very quickly, say something about our panelists. So we have Sarah Martel, who has moved a fair bit around academic jobs and is now at UNSW since 2014. Sarah, I think all of us, has been on both sides of academic hiring and promotion tables, and she looks forward to this opportunity of demystifying the hiring process. Yeah, then we have Chris Blake from Swinburne, who's been there since 2006 and teaches physics and does research in cosmology. Chris has quite some experience, having worked with almost 30 PhD students and postdocs in his career, and is very excited about supporting ECRs in their different career paths. Then we have Barbara Catinella, who since 2020 is a principal research fellow at ICRA, UWA. Barbara is originally from Italy, where she did her undergraduate studies, then a PhD at Cornell on the internal kinematics of disk galaxies in the local universe, and then on to postdoc positions at Arecibo and the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics, before finally coming to Australia as a future fellow, first at Swinburne and then at ICRA. From CSIRO, we have Ivy Wong, a radio astronomer based in Perth, who completed her PhD at Melbourne in 2008, and then was on several postdoc and fixed-term contract positions for another 11.5 years before securing an ongoing position at CSIRO. And finally, we have Chris Lidman. Chris is an astronomer with a PhD dating back to 1994. After that, Chris first worked at ESO and then at the Australian Astronomical Observatory. And since 2018, he is director of Siding Spring Observatory. So we have something of a mixture of people with different experience levels and knowledge of both sides of the aisle. So I think I'm going to assign our panelists first. And for the participants, I think you'll get breakout rooms that offer you equal opportunities. So I'm going to try to allow you to self-assign, but you can do it on a pretty random basis, really. And then I'd say have fun. I would just, now that we're all back, I would just like to use this opportunity to thank everyone, our panelists in particular, for sharing their experiences and offering advice to early career researchers. Much appreciated. And thanks to the early career researchers for participating and asking good questions. It's also nice. So it's nice to just create this atmosphere where the hierarchies sort of don't freeze, and it's not that because now you're on the other side of the table, you don't talk about these things anymore. it's important to, Sarah really put it very well in the statement that she sent to me, to demystify the whole process. And I hope we've achieved that, and you have been able to get some practical and useful advice. And I wish all the early career researchers here all the best with their applications to whatever postdoc positions, faculty positions. It's not an easy thing, but as Ilya put it, do remember why you're in for this, and do remember to be happy as much as possible. Remember that you must be true to yourself, that you can't bend yourself to some arcane plans of what you want to achieve. It all has to fit, and there's a lot of randomness involved. It's important to recognize that this doesn't mean that you can't influence things, but it just takes a lot of time and perseverance to do that. And but whatever you decide to do in the end, wherever you go, I hope it all works out nicely for you, and you find the job that you want. And hopefully we've given you some help with that. Okay, so thanks everyone. Thanks panel. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to Christian and Nicole, who have organized this together with me. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the day.